You've got 10 seconds. The countdown going on right now. I'm sorry, I'm not doing it the wrong way.
This is Play-by-Play Cast, the world's #1 sports media podcast. Wait, what?
Nobody's fact-checking it. Just keep going.
Here we go.
Who the hell is Happy Gilmore?
Got all that on camera, right, John?
Sure, I did.
All right, because the red light was not on.
The podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster.
Oh, you can stick me in some kind of Italian boat because that one is gondola.
Now, from New York, really?
All the big ones are from New York.
Your host, Joe Godet.
It's still Joel.
Yeah, he will not be able to see very well, Cotton.
Welcome back into Play-by-Play Cast, everybody. It is the podcast about play-by-play broadcasters for play-by-play broadcasters, hosted by a play-by-play broadcaster. My name is Joel Godet. I'm the television and radio voice of the Ball State University Cardinals, and you can find me on social media at Joel Godet, or you can find the podcast at PXPcast. Email me as well, jgodett@bsu.edu. It is the podcast where we dive into the tips, tricks, experience, stories, process, and preparations of some of the biggest and best play-by-play announcers in the business. Today, we have a first-time guest, long-time listener, or, well, first-time guest, listener. Cory Provus, radio voice of the Minnesota Twins, who has been listening to PXPcast for, I don't know, probably a couple of months now, found the podcast, followed me on Twitter, we began conversing that way, and this episode comes your way. And it happens to drop on the day that Major League Baseball teams across the country have returned to practice at their various stadiums. We are about 3 weeks away from the return of baseball season, at least at the Major League level. For all of you out there that are minor league broadcasters, it sucks. I was a minor league broadcaster 2009, 10, 11, 12, and 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. I was a minor league broadcaster from Salem, Virginia, to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, to Buffalo, New York, to Bradenton, Florida. It's an awesome experience, and I hurt for those guys and girls out there that aren't going to get to call games this summer, and some that are in potentially more perilous situations than that. But I also ache for people that aren't just broadcasters, because one of the things that I love about not being a minor league baseball broadcaster anymore is that I get to go to minor league baseball games. It's something I just enjoy doing. Like, it's great to call a game and sit in the press box and get that view of it. Baseball is my favorite sport, so I love broadcasting it. But I almost enjoy it more just to go sit on the berm and without responsibility, just take it in. Go to different ballparks, go to different places, see the types of food that different ballparks have, the different vantage points, the different types of things that different minor league teams do. I am a geek for minor league crazy names and logos and merch and mascots. Like, I love everything that is just wild and nuts about minor league baseball, and missing the fact that, you know, I can't take that in, and that impacts all of the people that work so hard to allow all of us as fans to have that experience. So here's to a speedy rest of the summer and a speedy off season and the arrival of 2021 so that we get some minor league baseball back as well. For the here and now on this episode, though, Cory Provus joins us as a guy that has called a little bit of minor league baseball in his career. He did some work as the voice of the Auburn Double Days right out of college, but then Cory took a route through collegiate athletics, working at Virginia Tech and then at UAB, and then he broke into Major League Baseball at a fairly young age. Before the age of 30, he wound up back in Chicago alongside Ron Santo and Pat Hughes, working with the Chicago Cubs, and from there, he sat next to Mr. Baseball and worked with the Milwaukee Brewers and Bob Uecker, and then he would move on to his current role with the Minnesota Twins. Along that, he has some pretty awesome stories to tell, and we will dive into all of that, but we start at Syracuse University, because yes, Cory Provus is one of us. He is a member of the Newhouse Mafia, and actually, when you go to WAER Radio, the student station, one of the student stations there, there's a picture of Cory hanging on the wall, interviewing lacrosse coach then and now, John Desko. And he is one of the guys. There's a wall. I don't even remember. There's like 4 pictures on this wall. One of them is this gathering of like the greats. It's 2 rows of people seated, and it's like Marv Albert, Bob Costas, Mike Tirico, Ian Eagle, Len Berman is in it. And like the picture next to it is Cory Provus interviewing John Desko. So forever cemented in WAER lore. And that is where we begin on today's episode with the voice of the Minnesota Twins. His name is Cory Provus.
So I've only been back, because of my summer job, I don't get back, Joel, to Syracuse all that often. And I want to say since I've graduated, I've only been back maybe, 4 or 5 times over the years. And I did, after WAER moved out of Newhouse 2 into their new location down the street, I stopped in there one day and I saw that picture. And I think I'm interviewing John Desko, the Syracuse lacrosse coach. Yep. And I didn't know that was going to be in there. And it brings back a funny story because so our junior year, when we're talking about, because I believe that was John Desko's first year as a head coach, and you may know this more than me, but I think his first year was either like 97 or 98 when he was the first-year head coach of Syracuse lacrosse. We were spitting around ideas in the studio about what should we name the pregame interview. And so it was myself and Jason Chandler and Gideon Cohn, who's now my agent, but is a good friend. But we also did radio together at AER. But the 3 of us are going around, and I had this idea of like, why don't we call it At the Desk with John Desko? And that was immediately ruled down. It didn't have much legs to it, but that was just an idea we were spitballing. But I remember just the laughter and the faces that both Chandler and Gideon they had towards my way about why don't we call it At the Desk with John Desko, and Chandler was like, what desk are you talking about? There's no desk. Just talk about the game and talk about the team. So it's funny that you bring up that picture because that's the first thing that comes to mind with John Desko. But I was lucky during my time at WAER to be around so many talented men and women. I was just there with a really good flock of talent, from Jamie Say to Adam Shine to Andrew Catalan to Carter Blackburn to Damon Amendolara. I mean, we were all separated. Matt Park. We were all Kevin Marr. We were all separated by a couple. Adam Zucker. We were all separated by a year or 2, and some were in my class and some were a year younger. But it was a really strong. Adam Cooperstein was around that time as well. It was a really strong contingent of talent, and it was the kind of talent that you got better, and you also knew early on who the big players were going to be. Like, I remember listening to a Jamie Say sportscast when I was a freshman, and I thought, man, she is awesome. Like, she is what we aspire to sound like and write like, and that was kind of the goal. And we all knew that Adam Shine was going to be a talk show star. We knew that Carter Blackburn was going to be really good, whatever path he went down in the play-by-play sphere, if it was going to be TV or radio. We just knew, you could tell early on who the big hitters were going to be and the success stories were going to be. But then I think back and look at their success now, but then I reflect back to when they were in college and they had this awesome work ethic. Like Adam Shine, he worked so hard to build the talk show staff, which did not exist at WAER until, I believe, his junior or senior year. So we're talking about 97, 98, 99, that era. There wasn't a talk show department, and we started a talk show, and Adam was the guy that really took the bull by the horns, and we even had a sponsor. There was a deli in town called Pickles Kosher Deli, and they sponsored the first ever talk show. It was Pickles Kosher Deli Double Overtime, and they would sponsor it was all grant driven, but they would sponsor the post game show after every SU football or basketball game, and it was so cool. to see this group of people be there at the outset of what's now become, I think, a popular department within the radio station. So that to me is what I look back on. The football was much better than the basketball. The basketball was not very good. The football team was winning so many games. They were ranked in the top 10, top 15. They were going to Orange Bowls. Being there with McNabb and Tabucky Jones and Donovan Darius and Rob Conrad, football was king when I was there. So that's what I think back on, was how competitive it was, but how much fun it was. And I think back to my friends really that are my friends today. Many of my college friends, if not all of my college friends, remain the group of people that I worked at and I work with at WAR.
I'm actually kind of disappointed it wasn't Desko's desk, because it's not much worse than Mike Check with Mike Hopkins. So as far as
so that was my thinking. So we had Mike Hopkins. So I figured we needed kind of a fun little name. So I did kind of go down that path. Like, all right, we have Mike Check. So what's wrong with at the desk with John Desko? And boy, that had no chance.
It is still called the Double Overtime, though. Although Pickles is, I just did a quick Google. Pickles is closed, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Bummer. Did you call the McNabb Virginia Tech game?
I was there. Yes, I was on the broadcast team, but the famous call was from John McCarthy, who everybody knows as Lou. So John McCarthy was a year older. I did some broadcasting out of school, but now is an accountant in Boston. He's one of my really good friends. But yeah, I was a junior. It was his senior year, and Adam Shine played a large role in me having that game. Because he looked out for me and thought I was deserving to get a big assignment. So I got play-by-play for the first and third quarters of that game, and then I did color for the second and fourth. But the McNabb to Berminski call, that was John McCarthy that had that epic call. More than 20 years ago.
What was the best moment that you were a part of broadcasting at AER?
Well, that was pretty high on there, because we saw the students rush the field. To see the game end, and that was the year before Michael Vick started his run at Virginia Tech. So that was just pre-Vick, but Virginia Tech was still a really good team. And to see the crowd react and to see Marshall Street explode in a way that I could only dream that probably would have been comparable to, say, a Final Four run or a national championship run, which happened, years later when I was already out of school. But that was probably the coolest moment I had in terms of broadcasting any one event. Any one game was that famous Syracuse win over Virginia Tech at the Dome on the McNabb to Berminski throwback across the field. I could still see it to this day, the left pylon, the end zone there, and I'll never forget that moment.
Poor Bill Roth, just torn inside.
Yeah, and that's another thing. So then Bill Roth, then like a year or so later, he has, Vic has this big run against Syracuse, and I believe it was at the Dome, and he played this call as part of his scene setter for years, working at Virginia Tech, and I worked for him out of school, so I heard this thing just ad nauseum all the time, and his line was that Michael Vick drives a dagger right into the hearts of the Orangemen. And I'm like, how could you say that? How could you say that with that much passion? But then I learned. But he was right. But that was later on. But I never really heard Bill's call though of the McNabb Berminski game. I've never heard it from the opposite side. But knowing him, I'm sure it was great. I'm sure he had a really good call. I'm sure he was bummed because he had to be, but I'm sure he still delivered nonetheless.
I want to ask you a little bit about Tech and some of the other stops you had early in your career. We talk a lot about path on this podcast and how no one path is the same. But how did yours play out of college in terms of the way that it set you up? And you bounced around a couple of times, but each time with a really big step forward and a really big purpose. And to go from Va Tech to UAB and then wind up in Chicago at 28 years of age. What happened for you in those first 5-6 years out of school that really set you up to be on the path you wound up?
Well, it's cool that we're doing this chat now, Joel, because it's really, we're approaching the 20-year anniversary of a very important decision that I made professionally. It was right out of school. I graduated in 2000. So it had to be, I'm guessing, in July. I don't know the exact date, but in July of 2000, I was just out of school. So I was, 22 years old, and I was looking for a job. And I thought my first job out of school was going to be in Charleston, West Virginia, working for another SU grad, and Tony Caridi. I interviewed with him, and I thought I was going to get it. I was going to live in Charleston, and I was going to anchor news throughout the week on the Mountaineer News Network, Monday through Friday. But then on weekends and nights, I would shift and do high school football and high school basketball play-by-play, and it was a full-time job, and I was really excited. I really thought that was going to be my first job out of school, and I didn't get it. So then I was sending out, resumes and tapes, and nothing really was firing. But then Ron Gleason, who is now part of the Bears broadcast team on WBBM in Chicago, but in the summer of 2000, he was the sports director of one of the all-sports stations in Chicago called The Score, which is still around to this day. And they had an opening for an update anchor, and it was going to be a full-time job. So I sent my tape in for that, and he liked my tape. At the same time, I got a phone call from Dave Pasch. Now, my senior year at Syracuse, so this was the spring semester of 2000, Dave Pasch was just wrapping up his first year as the voice of the Orangemen. He was an AER grad, but he was brought back to call SU games on the network station in town. But he was also an adjunct professor, and Dave taught the second semester. He taught a sports play-by-play class, and I had some credits to kill, and I thought it'd be kind of fun, but the only problem was that it was a Friday morning, 8:30 class. Now, as a senior, the last thing you want to do your last semester of school is take a Friday 8:30 a.m. class. But I took it, and it was one of the best decisions I made because I got to know Dave, and that summer of 2000, Bill Roth called Dave Pasch and said, hey, we have an opening to do Virginia Tech women's basketball. Do you have anybody from Syracuse, AER, that you would recommend? And Dave recommended me. So Bill reaches out to me, and Dave reaches out to me, and I said, absolutely, I'm interested. Yeah, I want to learn more about it. So I went down to Blacksburg for the interview, and that went well. I met with Bill. I met with others. I met with Bonnie Hendrickson, who was the head coach at the time. And it went really well, and then I was offered the job. Meanwhile, I was still in the running for the job in Chicago. And I was torn about what to do here because Virginia Tech needed an answer. Bill Roth needed an answer if I was going to take it or if he was going to go somewhere else. Do I go play-by-play in a small town not knowing anybody, or do I press my luck and ride it out, and at 22 years old I can be on regularly in my hometown, in my home market, in the number 3 market in the country at 22, and try my luck and being in Chicago. So I ended up calling Ron Gleason, and I told him, look, I'm not asking if you can promise me the job, but I have this offer in Blacksburg, and I'm going to take it unless you tell me otherwise. And he could not guarantee me the job. He said, you're in the running, but I can't guarantee you the job. So at that point, in around July of 2000, I made the decision to pass up Chicago and take the play-by-play job at Virginia Tech. And that set me on the path of doing play-by-play and strictly play-by-play, because if not, and that's what I always wanted to do, if I stayed in Chicago and say I got that job, all I was going to be doing was probably updates and maybe going out to cover teams and gather sound and file reports, which would have been neat, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. So in my gut, I knew I wanted to do play-by-play, and that decision was made to take that job, to take that chance in the summer of 2000 with Bill Roth and Virginia Tech.
Do you remember what your mindset was at 28 years old? Because, even now, I think about how I would approach, applying for a Major League Baseball job. And I can imagine what I would have thought when I was 28 years old trying to do that. What was your approach reaching out to the Cubs and saying, not only do I know I can do this, but I know I'm the person you need to hire?
So it goes back to that same summer of 2000 when I had the job at Virginia Tech. I grew up listening to WGN radio in Chicago. I used to listen with my dad driving to school. I just loved the station. I loved all the personalities. And I listened to games, of course. I listened to Harry, and I listened to, of course, Pat Hughes, and I just was a big fan of the radio station. The sports director at WGN Radio to this day, his name is Dave Ennett. He's been calling Northwestern football and basketball for years. He's in the Northwestern Hall of Fame. So in the summer of 2000, I was able to connect with him somehow, some way, and I sent him a tape, cassette tape. And I said, look, here's my work. I'm not looking for a job. I have a job, but I just want to introduce myself to you. Here's my work. And that was it. So I went down there and I met him and I gave him my tape. We sat, we talked for a little bit, and then I went about my business. But then once or twice a year, I would send him an email about what I was doing and where I was. So, hey, I just finished up, say, my second year at Virginia Tech. This would have been, the end of the 2001 season. Hey, Dave, I'm wrapping up my second year. Here's what I've been doing. Please keep me in mind should anything open up in the future. Now, one of your previous guests on this podcast, I wanted Andy Mazur's job. I thought Andy Mazur had a really cool job. And that was the job that I always had my eye on to be like, that would be a really fun job if I can get it. And then you go ahead to 2006. Now I'm in Birmingham. I just finished. Actually, let's go back to 2005. I interviewed for the UAB job, and the athletic director was also the head football coach. His name was Watson Brown. And as I'm sitting in his office talking about the job, he said, look, we like your work, but we don't want this to be a stepping stone right away. We want you to be here for a while. I said, Coach, I love college. I see myself on this college play-by-play path. I'm a big Cub fan. I don't see the Cubs knocking down my door with a job offer the next year, so I think you're all right. So I do that first year in 2006 with UAB football and UAB basketball, and then the Bears are playing in the Super Bowl in 2006. They're playing the Colts in Miami, and Andy Mazur is a finalist for the Padres play-by-play job to work with Ted Leitner and the Colonel, and so he's in this circle of finalists. At that point, I reach out to Dave Ennett and say, hey, I read that Andy might get this job. Again, can I send you my updated reel? And he said, yes, by all means, send it. So I had it ready to go. And then the moment that I saw that Andy got that job, it was FedEx the next day. But the thing was, from 2000 to 2006, it wasn't like Dave was wondering, hey, what have you been doing and where have you been? So he knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. And then when the job came open, I went after it. I really went after it hard, and I thought, you know what, if I could just get an interview, because I was told that I always interviewed for jobs well. And this goes back to a job I did not get when I was working at ISP Sports in Winston-Salem. I was a finalist for the Houston Cougar play-by-play job in 2004 or 2005, and I didn't get it. I was told I was the number 2 choice. And then I was working also on Georgia Tech's broadcast with Wes Durham, and Dave Brain was the AD at Georgia Tech at the time. And Dave told me, he said, look, this may be tough to hear, but before you could be number 1, you're likely going to have to be number 2. And I never forgot about that. And so I wasn't too discouraged that I didn't get the job, because I thought I interviewed really well for it. And I just gained experience after that process and confidence. And then the Cub job came open, and it was a whirlwind, man. The Cubs were wrapping up spring training in Arizona. And I went out there. It was the last week of spring training. And I went out there for an interview from Alabama to interview with some of the Cubs executives. This was a WGN job. This wasn't a Cubs job. This was a WGN job, but the Cubs had to sign off on the hiring. So I interviewed with John McDonough, who was the president of the team at the time, interviewed with Mike Lafrano, who was in charge of the broadcasting, interviewed with Peter Chase, who was in charge of communications and PR, and then I sat down with Pat Hughes and Ron Santo. Now, that to me was just that was like fantasy camp. I was more nervous about that than I was meeting with Cubs executives. And then when Pat told me, he said, "Look, I think you have the job. They wouldn't have flown you out here from Birmingham if we didn't think you were going to get it." And it wasn't until that moment that I was like, "Oh, I'm really going to get this job." And then I flew back home, and it was a Monday in Birmingham, and I was in the shower. And I didn't want to miss any phone calls. I'm taking the quickest shower of my life. I got pretty much the shower door open. And just as I got out, Dave Ennett from WGN called me and offered me the job. So it was a Monday. I packed up my little garden home, whatever I could, in Hoover, Alabama. And I left Alabama Wednesday, drove back to Chicago, got in late Wednesday night, repacked. I was at my parents' house, repacked, because then Thursday morning took a flight out from Chicago to Vegas. The Cubs were playing their last 2 spring training games in Vegas against Seattle. And I flew out Thursday. I shadowed a broadcast Friday. I was on the air Saturday. So I went from Birmingham Monday to that Saturday going on WGN and the Cubs network in a span of 5 days. So I didn't really have a lot of time to wrap my head around what all this was because it happened so late and that fast.
What's interviewing for a job of that magnitude like? Just like I think about, like we had Benetti on this podcast, and he talked about getting the White Sox job and sitting down with Jerry Reinsdorf, and in my mind I'm going, yeah, that's something. That would be a weird conversation for me. Like if I walked into a room with Jerry Reinsdorf, what would I say? What's it like for you to sit down with an executive like that when you start getting into the Brewers and the Twins job as well, and trying to prove yourself as who should be trusted as the voice of an organization like that?
Well, I think you have to. I've always had the mindset, and this is something that I started when I graduated from school, about how can I separate myself from other candidates? How can I? Because I think we all maybe sound the same. You know, some have, deeper voices. Some have better use of vocabulary. Some inflect better than others. Some write better than others. But what can we all do if we're all in the same group? Then I thought, all right, how can I separate myself from the pack? And at first I thought presentation perhaps could go a long way. So as I would send out tapes and then later CDs of my work, on CDs especially, I'd print out, labels, sticker labels that I put on the CD with my name, the tracks, but then also put the mascot of the school. So when I was applying for Houston, I put the UH logo on the label. When I was applying for UAB, did the same thing. For Tulane, did the same thing. I always thought about presentation. With the Cubs, what I wanted to do, and this wasn't so much with the Cubs executives, this was more with WGN, because I had a first interview with them before that flight out to Arizona. I first had to fly to Chicago to interview with WGN. I thought it was cool to mention sponsors. I thought it would help my cause to mention sponsors. So I would say, because I knew, listening to Andy Mazur as much as I did and listening to that broadcast as much as I did, when I was doing a scoreboard update, it wasn't just a scoreboard update. It was a square D scoreboard update. It was part of the power at Wrigley Field. It was old style. I knew was a WGN sponsor. Budweiser was a Cubs sponsor. It was trying to always find little ways to separate myself from other candidates. Now, maybe they were all doing the same thing. I didn't know. But I thought that if I did those little things early, that would stand out to executives, to give them a different perspective, to give them a different answer. So that's how I always thought on the front end. On the back end, it was about just showing personality, but not like you own the room. And I got taken to the principal's office one time in my big league career, and it was something that I screwed up, and I learned from it. Haven't done it since. When I used the cliche, like, this isn't my first rodeo. Well, that's one thing to say around your friends. It's not something to say when you're 28 years old and you're and the traveling secretary of a big league team hears you say that. That's the last thing that needs to happen. So, and it happened, and I learned, and so it was listening, but going in with questions that because you're going to get it. You're going to get the executive saying, hey, they're talking to you for a while, and then they're going to want to know, is there anything that I can answer? So being prepared with questions, not so much about pay. Don't worry about that, but just expectations, work ethic, getting along with people, how to help out other departments. That was a part of my job at WGN, was to help out the sales staff if they needed players to read liners. That was something that I was happy to do, and that is something that you just can't go in, with his mindset that I'm just going to do play-by-play. I'm just going to do the pregame show. I'm just going to do the postgame show. You have to be open-minded and ready and willing to help as many people as possible, because if you don't, they're going to remember that more than how you sound.
Let's talk about how you sound a little bit. I've read in a couple of different spots, like when we do one of these, like I just pull up a bunch of articles and see what comes up, and one of the constant themes was people noted how much you have a good time, how much you don't take yourself too seriously. There was one quote that actually said the one thing that someone liked about you was that you didn't take yourself too seriously and had the ability to laugh at yourself on the air. The Twins release noted your sense of humor on the air, and that I feel like is something that can be difficult because a lot of times we think we're funny and we're really not, and being able to convey that actual enjoyment and humor and affability on the air is a difficult thing, or sometimes more difficult than we give it credit for. Why for you does it work, and what have you been able to figure out in terms of letting that side of your personality shine through?
It works because that's who I learned from. It works because I learned from Bill Roth and Mike Burnup, who were nicknamed the Buffet Buddies, who they had a job to do, but they had all these characters. Bill was a bad driver. So Mike would sit shotgun and Bill would drive, and they'd get into an accident nearly every time they traveled to Miami or they were going to, Syracuse, wherever they were going. They would just be an incident that I know would come up on the air, or Bill would forget a pair of socks in the hotel room and in the drawer, and Mike would call him Forgetful Freddy on the air. So I learned that early on that the idea that you have to take yourself so seriously and you have to put on this fake voice and you have to be so monotone, I learned from the get-go that that's the wrong way to approach this. And then when I get to work with this big personality like Wes Durham, and it's almost like osmosis, this guy has so much fun at what he's doing. And it's a job, but it's like, is it really a job? I know we work at it, but this guy is just having the best time. So then when I would listen to him every day, I was a part of his broadcast team doing pre and post and halftime for Tech basketball and Tech football for all those years. That's where my foundation really began. And then when I got the chance to build my own at UAB, that's what I wanted to continue. And then at the major league level, where I thought, my goodness, we're going to have to be so stiff, well, then I meet these two characters, Pat and Ron. And then I and I heard them forever, and I heard them laugh, but I was like, they can't really laugh that much. But then you see it, and you're around it, and Ron Santo, it wasn't even a choice. It was required that you had to laugh at yourself because nobody did it better than him. Nobody that I've met in my life did it better than he did. And Ron Santo, all of his ailments, never once complained about, his prosthetics, about his heart, about his bladder, about his toupee, which he called a gamer. I mean, he always was able to laugh at himself. And that's where it began for me. And then I go to Milwaukee, and I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm working with Bob Uecker, who appeals to everybody, not just baseball. That's different than Ron Santo. Ron Santo, he appealed to Cub fans, and he appealed to those with diabetes. But Uecker, he appealed to baseball. He appealed to movies. He He appealed to Johnny Carson. He appealed to television. He appealed to Miller Lite commercials. He covers all the bases. So you go from Santo to Uecker, and it's like, my goodness, we're going to do what? We're going to laugh like this. We're going to have all this. We're going to have this laughter go on every day. I couldn't help but bring that to what I do in Minnesota. And Dan Gladden's like that. He is so on board with being that way that when I first met Dan, we went out to dinner, my wife and Danny and his wife, after I got the job in downtown Minneapolis, and he was telling me his story about he wasn't this destined broadcaster. He started in broadcasting by chance in 2000, and the radio station employed him at the time, WCCO, and said, hey, we just want you to be you. Well, if you know anything about Dan Gladden, he's a maverick, man. This guy, we are yin and yang. I mean, he's riding motorcycles and I'm riding Schwinn's. I mean, he's jumping off roofs. I'm staying on my couch. I mean, we are complete opposites, but it works because it's funny and it's entertaining. We don't miss anything. I hope that people understand that we're not just up there doing comedy for 3 hours. We get serious when we have to, but we have to have fun. We really have to have fun, and that's my favorite compliment that we've ever received as a team. It's not, boy, I loved how you nailed that Nelson Cruz home run or that Irvin Santana shutout or that Joe Mauer at bat. It sounds like you guys are having fun each and every day. And with all up until 2019, the Twins were terrible. I mean, they had a brief playoff run in 2017, but they were losing 90-some-odd games a year, almost on average from 2012, leading into 2019. So there wasn't a lot of good baseball that I watched up until 2019. So if you're not going to have fun, then you're probably going to drive yourself out of the game.
Tell me about Bob Uecker. What would people not know if they weren't around him on a daily basis?
He is a really good broadcaster. I mean, he's a Hall of Fame broadcaster. People think of Bob as funny, and people think of Bob as Harry Doyle and George from Belvedere and, again, the Johnny Carson spots. But I think of Bob as like he nailed some awesome calls. I mean, the 2011 team was a really good Milwaukee team. So to be there and to listen to his call of Nigel Morgan's walk-off hit in Game 5 of the NLDS to beat Arizona, that is a great call. Going back earlier, Trevor Hoffman became the first closer to reach 600 saves. To hear him call that play, ground ball to short, Counsell, up with it, throws, he did it. I mean, that's a really good call. And I just love those moments of Bob calling big moments, fielder home runs, Braun home runs. I just always like the way that he calls a game. And then he taught me that you don't have to talk every second on the air, that you can let it breathe. Let the game breathe. And I in college, you think like you're taught that's the worst thing possible. That dead air is the worst thing. But is it really dead air? If you're not talking, is it truly dead air, or are there other sounds that are helping tell this story to those listening? And to me, the answer is yes. You're hearing vendors. You're hearing people chatting. You're hearing sounds of the game. You're hearing the PA announcer announce something in between at the at-bat. That, to me, is part of it. So Bob's whole thing about let the game breathe, it sticks with me every day. And I think about it every day that we're on the air. But he's funny. He's genuine. He was incredibly kind to me and my wife. He was welcoming. He challenged me to get better, because you're often by yourself. Bob and I, we weren't on the air a ton together, but if I wanted him on the air with me, I'd ask him, and he'd be on with me more times than not. But in the first inning, ninth inning, game starting, game is tight, your job is to stay out of the way and let Bob do his thing. He's a treasure, but he made me better. And no doubt to have, Bob Uecker on your resume and Ron Santo on your resume, that no doubt helped me get this job in Minnesota.
How do you make a baseball broadcast different? And I don't mean that on a day in and day out basis, but more a year in and year out basis, where, there are stories about people that I'm sure are ones that stick with you and that you really like, or when you see this guy, this will always come to mind, or being able to tell histories of things in different ways and not get to a day where it's like, not like a this day in baseball history moment, but like some sort of nugget of something where it's like, oh yeah, but we told that story last time we saw this team. What's the way that you go about dredging up and organizing so that you know where it is when you need it? Good information to keep stories, histories, teams, identities fresh.
I'm somebody that I just retain things visually. That I remember, I can recall moments if I see them. That's just how I process things. So I just remember moments from players, past, present, if I just see it. Not so much the dates, but I'll remember pretty much the nuts and bolts about what happened, the outcome, and all that. That's something that I don't know why I have something that it stuck with me as a kid. That's why I think I remember all these random movie lines from the 1980s that if I see something, I can remember it. For me, in terms of the play-by-play mechanics, I try to challenge myself every year. I don't listen to myself very much. You catch them on the highlights here and there if you put on MLB Network, and the highlights might be on there, or you see them on social media, but I don't make it a purpose, which I don't recommend. It's not something that I probably should do more of. But and it's not like going back to Bob. This always surprises people, but Bob has never seen the movie Major League start to finish. As good as he was in that movie, he's never sat down and watched the whole thing, because he'll tell you that he could have done better with that line. That line that we all love and we think is just a classic line. He'll say, nope, I was too early on the timing there. I could have inflected that word differently. In that respect, I just think it doesn't sound as good when I go back and listen to it, and vice versa. If I think I really botched a call, then I'm more prone to go back and listen to it, and more times than not, it's not as bad as I thought it was. But in terms of play-by-play mechanics, how can I challenge myself? So instead of saying, and this has evolved over the years, that, swing a fly ball to right center, Buxton drifting back, reaches up and makes a cap-high catch, 1 out. Maybe I would have said this fly ball to right center, Buxton ranging back to his left, reaches up, makes the catch. But I think adding cap-high, adding, near his left shoulder makes the play. I think adding just more description is how I can challenge myself year in and year out. That to me is that's what I want to do. And, I do the uniforms. People like them. Some do, some don't. But that's part of what I do. I just have the things that I like. And, but I try to challenge myself with the mechanics of the broadcast, what I can do every year, and just try to mix up my terminology a little bit more. And, Bill told me this back when I was working with him, that I really believe that if you're working in the medium of radio, I think it's impossible to be too descriptive. I don't know how you can do that. I think you can always describe more. And if you can always give the score, you can always give the inning. That to me is part of it. But I just try to challenge myself mechanically each and every year. And the stories, they'll come. It's harder and harder now. Players seem to be more distant than they were even, 5, 6, 7 years ago. It's harder to get to know guys. There's more people around, and guys are a little bit more standoffish than I think they once were. So that to me is another challenge. And now with this whole COVID pandemic, it's going to be even harder to share these stories, which is going to be a challenge.
How do you overcome that?
I don't know yet. That's going to be something we're going to find out here soon.
Well, not even the COVID side of things. Just with the fact that it's harder to get that time with people nowadays, and you're not able to get the kind of access that maybe you were used to getting, as you said, 6, 7, 8 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, and a lot of it now. I just try to get cell phone numbers of players if I need to ask them something, because I just don't want. Because I've done I don't have this lengthy minor league resume, right? That's something that people bring up to me a lot, but I've done just about everything. I think over my career, I've done a lot of different sports. For some good pay, some no pay, some was just a meal ticket, a lot of driving, all that, different, you name it, but the access to players has changed over the years. The days of just, being the only media personality around and walking up to guys, that's long gone. So now it's about trying to get cell phone numbers from guys, because I just don't want to wait around for them by their locker if they're eating, if they're getting treatment, and I'm wasting time that I could be doing something else with. So I just try to shift that, maybe get a cell phone number now and just try to go that road, but down that road. But it's hard. It's not easy to get. I try to pick my spots more or less before the game. I'll go in the clubhouse before the game. I'm there every day. I'll go about 15 minutes around. If there's a player that I didn't see that I really needed to get something from, then I may go back down during BP. But I'm spending less time on the field than I was a few years ago, because I just get the impression that they don't want us there. And that's when they're out there working. That's when they're around their teammates and around their coaches. So the days of me putting my arm up against the turtle shell, that to me is probably gone, which isn't a bad thing. That's where the players work and that's their time. But those days when I used to do that with just ease and it seemed like it was welcoming, I think the game is shifting away from that. Certainly for people like me, now former players, analysts, that's a different story. But for just a play-by-play broadcaster, I think those days of just being able to do that are probably in the past.
How do you get seen as Cory, the good guy that we don't mind him being around and we'll talk to him about anything, as opposed to Cory, the radio guy, who is curious about this, that, and the other for the air?
I mean, I think for me, I'm just careful about my opinion, and this is where some friends and colleagues, we differed. We've had good, heated conversations over drinks over this, but I'm fine giving my opinion if I'm asked. So throughout a normal season, I go on, Twins affiliates and their radio shows throughout the week, and I don't shy away from tough questions. If I'm asked a tough question, I'll gladly give my answer. But I believe my job is to call the game. My job is to call the game, and I lean on Dan to provide the analysis. I think I can get myself in trouble if I start questioning pitch selection, if I question route running, if I question strategy. That, to me, is where I can get myself in trouble. Do I know the game? Sure. But am I an expert? No way am I an expert. I learn more about the game every year. I hope the day never comes when I feel like I've learned everything about the game, because it's always evolving, it's always changing. I'm a big fan of the analytics and sabermetrics, which is a challenge doing that in radio because it's a lot of numbers, some acronyms in there as well, and you try to bunch them all together, you might lose some people, but those are risks I'm willing to take as long as you separate them and you kind of, once in a while, if not on a weekly basis, remind the listeners what they all mean. I'm there for players. I'm open to hosting their charitable initiatives, their dinners, their luncheons, whatever. If you start saying no to that stuff, that's when you get yourself in trouble. But I just back off. I back off a little bit, and I've done that over time. And I don't think I need to command the room. That's another thing. That if I'm in the clubhouse, I'm not just kind of hanging around. I'm in there for a reason and a purpose. And once I get my answers, then I get out. So I think in a way, less is more has been working out for me better in recent years than it was earlier.
I want to ask about your voice quickly too, just because you've got a good resonant broadcast voice when you're just talking here. How long have you sounded like this, and what was kind of the work in that went into creating that instrument?
I'd love to tell you it was all the same stuff you heard, that, your diaphragm and comes into play. But I think I was younger, I was talking too fast. And I think that's what stands out when I listen to some tapes now, is that just slow down. Everything, I think, sounds better if you just slow down. Now, it doesn't have to be so slow, but I think if you just slow down your pace, you slow down your breathing. And I worked with a vocal coach in town. when in Minneapolis not long after I moved here, because after my first year, I just thought I was running out of breath on triples in the corner, on exciting plays that I don't think I was inflecting the way that I wanted to. So I worked with a vocal coach about how to slow some things down and do some breathing exercises that I still do to this day. So my voice, I think, over time has just matured, and it used to be somebody else's voice. I used to get a lot of comparisons to Tom Brenneman because I loved doing Tom Brenneman comps when I was younger. I would just do a lot of Brenneman impressions, and I do a lot of John Sterling impressions, and it just became somebody else. And it was a challenge working. It wasn't so much my voice, but what was coming out of my mouth, not how I sounded, but the words. In 2007, the Cubs had an outfielder named Matt Merton, but Pat would call him Matt Merton. So then when I would come on for the fifth inning, what was I supposed to say? Do I still say Merton, or do I say Merton? And then I started saying Merton. And then Dave Ennett, my boss, he said, just say Merton. Just let Pat say Merton. You just say Merton. And it just kind of I learned from there how to just get comfortable with my own voice and not try to sound like Pat, not try to sound like Tom Brenneman, but just, be myself. And as the years have gone on, when the moment gets exciting, I back away from the mic a little bit, so I don't want to overmodulate. But I still want to get it in. I want that excitement to crescendo, and I want to hit all the right notes. But I don't want it to sound crappy because I was screaming. So I think over time you just get comfortable with it. But to me, it always boils down to breathing and pacing. If I do that, then more times than not, my voice will hang in there.
What'd you learn going to a vocal coach at that point in your career too, and I guess humbling yourself to be able to say, like, hey, I want to make a couple of tweaks and changes here?
Yeah, but another reason that it was important to do it was because the White Sox are in the same division, and there's a word that I struggle saying, and to this day I'm not comfortable saying the word cellular. I have to say it really slow and slowly. So the White Sox used to play. I'm so happy they changed the name of their ballpark to Guaranteed Rate Field. But when we would go to U.S. Cellular Field, see how slow I had to do it there with the two L's is tricky. And it just is one of those that I just get, like when I say particularly. That's one that I'm not sure if I just said it there, if I hit every syllable or if I missed one. So that to me, I was missing syllables. I don't think I was enunciating everything in a way that I wanted to. That I think, Pat does really well, and Len Casper does really well, and Brian Anderson and Scott Fransky. I think, these guys that just call all these big moments, you just never question what word was that. So those were some of the things that I was really focusing on, and I had a speech impediment when I was younger. I had a hard time with R's and W's. And that's why when I went to Milwaukee, the last player I wanted to see was Ricky Weeks, because there were times I was going to say Wiki Weeks and the Detroit Red Wings. And sure enough, the Twins AAA team is the Rochester Red Wings. I was like, it could be another team, any other team, please. But that was something that, to this day, if I have to connect R and W, I'll know it beforehand, but I have to really slow down. So the genesis behind the vocal coach was when I went back, because I listened to myself probably more in 2012 than I have any other year. It was my first year with the Twins, and I wanted to see how it sounded, how it was going. And I just felt like I was missing out on words. And that was the genesis behind it, was to make sure that I'm not losing a syllable when I'm describing action.
How much do you listen to yourself now?
Not too often. I listen back more on TV than I do on radio, and I'm having a really good time doing TV. Because it's such a drastic shift to do the different medium, and the challenge was, can I really talk less? After doing all this radio, can I really talk less? And doing basketball, but then doing football last year on FS1, I had such a good time. And doing these Pac-12 After Dark games with Shane Green and Petros Papadakis, I just wanted to see in my mind was I talking less? In my mind, I thought I was, but then in reality, was I really doing it? And it's funny, we talked, the first question you asked me about, my time in college, one of the guys I did radio with in college was my producer on football this year for FS1, and Mike Principato. So it's kind of come full circle that we're back together again. But so I would lean on him a lot and say, hey, I tell him before we start, make sure I'm off my board, get my eyes off my board and watch the field. And secondly, just be mindful of what's coming out of my mouth, how often it's coming out of my mouth, and make sure that I'm using program, that I'm talking about what you're showing. And that, to me, I really am having fun doing television because of the team aspect. Radio, we are our own producers and directors. Now, we still work as a team, but we are our own. We get this blank canvas to paint, and it's so fun. What kind of brush do we want to use? What kind of colors do we want to use? How do we want to paint this picture today? That's so much fun. TV, whole different challenge. TV, it has to be a team. And if it's not, then it's going to show, and you're going to make a lot of people working in the truck look really bad if you're not on the same page with them.
You've loved radio more originally, right?
Yep. Yeah, radio's always been my first love. There's no doubt about that. Radio's been my first love just because of Harry Carey, growing up and WGN radio and hearing my dad tell stories about Jack Brickhouse and all those great Cup games he used to listen to as a kid on the radio. So radio was kind of where I was going. I had some professors in college that were pushing me more on doing TV news. I had one of my senior year. Bob Lissett was one of my professors senior year, and he told me don't rule out, doing TV news. And I love politics. I'm really into politics, always have been. So that's always been in the back of my mind. But I just love being at an event. Being a sports anchor was never something that was interesting to me. But being at an event, it's unscripted, and calling those big moments, that was something that I just knew that's where I wanted to go, and radio seemed to be the best route for me, especially that I had experience doing so in college.
Cory, last thing, I'll let you go on this note. I wanted to go back to the very beginning of your career. We'll go secularly here. One of your first jobs was with the Auburn Doubledays, correct?
Yeah, sure was.
I was just curious your thoughts on kind of where baseball is as a sport right now in terms of, I guess, how sad it will be to see some of those teams likely go away.
Yeah, the New York Penn League, that would probably be in the contraction plans that I'm reading with MLB and minor league baseball. But it's terrible. It's devastating. It's devastating for not just us, Joel, as broadcasters, but for players, for communities who thrive on those summers, those small towns. Thrive on those summers to get the chance to go out, and it's such a family experience. The ticket prices are cheap, concessions are cheap, the player access to get autographs, there's nothing like it. So it's a shame because I look back on that summer that I had, the 98, I think it was, Auburn Doubledays, and that was a really good team. I mean, you think off a New York Penn League team, maybe two players will reach the big leagues. Well, there were a handful of guys that were on that team, from Roy Oswalt to Johan Santana to Morgan Ensberg to Colin Porter to Keith Ginter. There were a lot of guys that were on that team that reached the big leagues, which is saying something. And they were the co-champions that summer because you have to finish.
Did you say Johan Santana
by Labor Day?
Did you say Johan? Did you say
Johan
Johan?
Santana was on the team? Yep.
My goodness.
Johan Santana. I picked Roy Oswalt up at the airport. That was part of my job because I did PA for home games, did play-by-play on the road. But part of my job was to pick up players at the airport in Syracuse and take them out to Auburn. And Roy Oswalt was one of the guys that I picked up, and he called me Shrimp all summer. And then when I finally crossed paths with him later on at the big league level, we had a good laugh about it. But it was a great experience for me, and I learned a great deal. And it was a good lesson, too, that I started to think about who was listening. This is more than just mom and dad or my brother or family, but about who's listening, who's out there, and can I make this experience better for any individual? can I put at ease the pain that this individual may be feeling in terms of their personal life? If the bills are piling up, they can't pay their rent, maybe something is going on at home. They're looking for an escape. And it was summertime, and to think about, let this be that escape. And that's how I viewed it. And over time, I haven't lost sight of that. And over time, too, I haven't lost sight of the fact that I'm not going to change, what I do just because one person doesn't like it. I read an interview years ago. I think it was with Dave Matthews was interviewed in Rolling Stone a long, long time ago. And Dave Matthews was asked about audience and about a show, and he mentioned how out of 100 people, if there was one person who did not like his set list, his show, that was going to weigh on him all night long into his next show, and so on and so forth. And I thought of that, and I never forgot that. And then I always thought, okay, as the years went by, how can I prove that one person? How can I get that person back on my side? But now I'm of the mindset that I don't care. That if there's 99% of the people that like what we do and what I do, then I'm not gonna change just because that one person doesn't like how I sound or how I say it. And that just evolved over time because I was so involved early on. If I got an email, if I got a tweet from somebody that didn't like what I said, I would say, okay, I'll do better and I'll try to fix it. But now it's like I might respond to that person and just say, thank you for listening. Sorry I didn't like it. Take care. But I'm not going to change the way I say it anymore just because if there's one or two people that don't like what we're doing, but the majority does, then why would I upset that group of people? And that's just taken some years and maturation on my part to understand.
Cory, how do people find more of you if they want to listen or find you on social media?
Yeah, my Twitter account is my name, at Cory Provus, but I'm on Instagram, and I don't post a whole lot, but at Cory Provus, by all means, reach out. But it's been a summer of adjustment for everybody. And for me, I have a 7 and a 4-year-old, so I've gotten more time with them than I ever have in my life. So that's been the silver lining, has been being with my family through all this. But by all means, it looks like baseball is going to pick back up here pretty soon. And hopefully everything works out for you, Joel, in the fall, and everything in the fall and the winter and calendar can play without interruption, because that would be important.
All right, that is Cory Provus joining us here on PXPcast. More baseball coming your way next week. We'll talk with the voice, or one of the voices, of the Los Angeles Dodgers, Charlie Steiner, and we will get into a ton of things ranging from working with the Yankees to working for ESPN to working for the Dodgers to working for the USFL to how he went from radio to television and back to radio, and there was some phenomenal storytelling with Charlie Steiner. It's going to be a really good time next week. Many thanks to Cory Provus for this week. Here's to baseball coming back soon. My name is Joel Gannett. The music is from Marshmello. This is PXPcast, and we are out.
And that will do it from St. Louis, where the score is inconclusive.